let's do a little history lesson of the Canon cameras, specifically Canon hybrids. Now, understand, I am primarily focused on video, but I really enjoy photography as well. But my main passion and career is video-centric. So hybrids have always filled a really nice spot for me throughout my career and being kind of a perfect go-to camera for both achieving great video in many cases, as well as being able to supplement and complement with photography. So I do come at this from that approach. I'm not purely a photographer or purely a filmmaker. I really am the kind of user I imagine who would benefit the most from hybrid style cameras. And what's great about what Canon has done since the very beginning is they kind of kicked this whole thing off. So I think that's what we should do. We should start at the beginning. Let's take a look at the 5D Mark II. I'm sure you're very familiar with the 5D Mark II. This camera was everything they say it is to this day. I mean, it's held in such high regard because of what it brought to the table. Now, the 5D Mark II was announced in 2008. So right at this time, before this, you have to understand, there wasn't shallow depth of field video really in any meaningful way for someone who could shoot affordably. Sure, there were high-end digital cinema cameras at this time, but these were extremely out of reach for most independent filmmakers and independent content creators, videographers, etc. So with the 5D Mark II implementing live view for photographers, where you can like look at the screen and kind of see the live feed of what's happening, that technology was easily translated into recording video. Again, before this, if you had a DSLR, you were looking through the viewfinder. Most point and shoot cameras had the technology to where you could look at the LCD and you could frame a shot. And at the time, there were a lot of people who were uncomfortable transitioning from point and shoots to DSLRs because they weren't used to looking through a viewfinder. You look through an optical viewfinder, you don't see exposure, you are just kind of judging like what, based on your settings, what the shot is going to look like. And this can frustrate some beginner photographers, and it really made that gap between amateur and professional really wide. Well, implementing live view where you can see your exposure right on the LCD screen is fantastic, and it's kind of cheating is how it's viewed in some cases. But implementing live view for photography allowed Canon to record video, 1080p video, which also at this time back in 2008, HD was just starting to become kind of this prominent thing where people knew they wanted it, they knew they needed it. You could broadcast in HD, but doing it was very, very expensive. The 5D Mark II changed all of that. You could now get shallow depth of field because before you were dealing with 1/3" sensors, and to go to full frame for video was just insane, the difference and jump from 1/3" camcorders to something like the 5D Mark II. You've got better low light shooting because it's a full frame sensor. You can do higher ISOs. You could record to cheap media, compact flash, like it was relatively affordable, where a lot of the stuff beforehand was proprietary media. And you just had this explosion of creation from the 5D Mark II. Plenty of people have talked about the 5D Mark II and just how much it changed things at the time. And it really was the start of the DSLR revolution for all intents and purposes. Everyone loved this camera and couldn't wait to have it. And then things started to trickle out into the other Canon products. I'm not going to get into the 7D and the 60D and some of their other alternates. I'm going to try and stick with kind of the main flagship cameras throughout this to just talk from start to finish to see how things progressed and why I think from my perspective Canon kind of dropped the ball and failed at what they started. So the 5D Mark II starts things in 2008 and is an incredible camera, but it had its flaws. At launch, it didn't record 24 frames a second. It was just 30p. And so as a filmmaking tool, people wanted that 24p for the true film look. It was later implemented with a firmware update, but there was some aliasing and moire with the 5D Mark II, and it wasn't quite perfect because it was kind of this add-on and not truly intending to be this video camera, but a lot of people ended up buying the camera for that purpose, as well as photography, starting that kind of hybrid shooter mentality where you didn't have to have two cameras, you could do everything all in one. Well, years later, in 2012, Canon releases the 5D Mark III, or at least announced it on March 2nd. DP review only has the announcement dates up here at the top. You can look at the reviews when those came out to kind of get a better estimate of when it was actually released, and I'm sure you can find that somewhere, but for these purposes, I think the announcements make a lot of sense as we talk about this. So they announce it in March of 2012, and when it finally comes out, it was an improvement on the Mark II, but the Mark III was still 1080p, it still didn't do high frame rate HD, and it was just kind of fixing some of those bugs and quirks of the aliasing array. But you notice that like the 1080p wasn't actually 1080p. I did a video on this years ago because I shot with the 5D Mark II and then the Mark III, and then we'll get to the Mark IV. But the Mark III records 1080, but there's a difference between recording resolution and true detail resolution. Just because it's a 1920 by 1080 video doesn't mean you have all the detail possible in a 1080p video. You can do this very easily by just taking a high-res photo and scaling it down to 1080p and then comparing it to what that looks like 1080p from the 5D Mark III. I guarantee you will be disappointed with the 1080p quality you can get from the Mark III. So kind of disappointing, a little underwhelming. It worked for most people as far as meeting their needs and fixing some of the bugs from the 5D Mark II in terms of video functions, but it also didn't introduce anything new to the table. And I think there's a reason for that you can look at, because again, this was 2012. Well, in late 2011, Canon announces Cinema EOS, or Cinema EOS, however you like to say it. And this was the pivot. When you go all the way back to the 5D Mark II in 2008, Canon unleashed Pandora's box. They didn't know what they had done, and now to save themselves for their high-end cameras, they, from my perspective, neglected the Mark III and did the bare minimum and opted instead to introduce us to Cinema EOS, which a lot of people like. This is the C300, the C500, the C100, and then all the Mark variations after which they're good cameras. They're great cameras in many cases, but they're definitely in a separate league compared to hybrid style shooting, and they are significantly more expensive. So all the people who bought the 5D Mark II and then were maybe disappointed by what the Mark III offered were now set up for a system where they would have to spend significantly more money to get what they were starting to desire, because we're 4 years now after the 2008 5D Mark II, and time is quickly moving on, and people are desperate for higher end video features, true 1080p, better codecs, just better video functionality. Is it, Canon's obligation to put it in their photography cameras? No, they don't have to. But I think people felt a little betrayed that their enthusiasm for what made the 5D Mark II so successful was then translated into higher end cameras that were much more expensive and just out of reach for a lot of people. Well, time moves on, and of course we have the 5D Mark IV. At this point, in 2016, Canon was looking a little weak by not having 4K on these type of cameras. So they introduced it with the 5D Mark IV. But again, a poor implementation of 4K. This was a really inefficient codec, huge file sizes, and it was a crop of the sensor. I also shot with the 5D Mark IV. It's not a fun camera to shoot 4K with because it's inconvenient, and you have a full frame camera probably because you want your images to have full frame field of view. So to have a crop mode for 4K was also underwhelming and disappointing. And this seems to be the track record for Canon, that they keep doing these kinds of moves for the sake of protecting their high-end line, or they just don't have the technical expertise to do it. I don't know the reasons behind the scenes, but again, I would say a slight disappointment. And also at this time, you have it being still a DSLR, meaning there's a mirror box inside, while the rest of the industry is going towards mirrorless, and Canon has yet to catch up with their flagship models. So 2016, they're kind of dropping the ball a little bit, falling behind the curve, and in a lot of ways delivering stuff that isn't quite what people want, or it is what they say they want, but the execution is handled poorly. So I would say the 5D Mark IV, although highly regarded for the photography capabilities, again neglected in terms of video as something that should and could be a great hybrid camera. Then, of course, Canon goes mirrorless, a full frame with the EOS R, which was announced in 2018, 2 years later. And the EOS R is, as we've come to expect from Canon, a little bit underwhelming in the video department. It does 4K, but it's only 30 frames a second or 24. It doesn't really do some of the high frame rate stuff that in 2018 was starting to become more and more common on cameras of this caliber. And although it does a lot of great things, it doesn't do anything significant to separate itself. You have the people who love Canon, you love their lenses, and they're happy with it. But for the rest of people who are still waiting for that 5D Mark II, that feeling, that energy, they released the EOS R and it isn't quite there. And I think you'll understand why I say that when we go to what's next, which is the R5, which is the newly announced new flagship from Canon that was rumored to have some of the best, most amazing video features you could ever dream up on a hybrid camera. Announced July 2020 officially, rumored before that. This signaled in a lot of ways for people who were following the news, heralding back to the 5D Mark II, something that would be a game changer, that would introduce 8K RAW, that would allow you to shoot 4K 120 without a crop, internal stabilization, some of the best autofocus in the industry. And 2020 could have been the year that Canon won, from my perspective. They could have had all-in-one. You'll have a lot of people who say the R5 is great for photography, and this is true. I haven't used it myself, but most of the tests I see online looks pretty incredible. The tracking and autofocus and just all around 45 megapixels as a photography camera is incredible. The RF lenses are fantastic. And so when you look at it from a photography perspective, I think most photographers are very happy with it. But Canon did themselves a disservice by starting the whole DSLR revolution and then not living up to their reputation and introducing a whole separate line for their cinema stuff. And with the R5 highlighting and touting those video capabilities, the 8K RAW, the 4K 120, now that it comes out that these modes are compromised by overheating, and really to use the camera for video, you can shoot 4K 30 or 4K 24, kind of what we're all used to. And do the images look good? Yes, they do. Do you have some nice features there where you can use autofocus and stabilization? Yes, you do. But what was supposed to be a game changer is just another average, mediocre video hybrid. And not even that, maybe even underwhelming, considering how bad some of these overheating problems are, and the recovery times on the camera are just kind of unacceptable, I would say, in that regard. So you'll have photographers who say that it's a photography camera. If you want a video camera, buy a real video camera. But I think this is a disservice to all the people who got into this or were inspired by the 5D Mark II and the possibilities that were unlocked for a huge portion of the market that didn't have access to anything like this at the time. If you were there, you know what it was like. If you're newer or you weren't paying attention, the 5D Mark II was a revolution. It changed everything. And for Canon to be resting for so long and then to say the R5 is coming, it does everything you want, because again, the EOS R was fine, it was acceptable, but it wasn't what people were necessarily clamoring for. It's just finally Canon is going mirrorless with their full frame cameras. Thank goodness. You see their promise of the R5 and what it could have been and now what it actually is. And that's why I say Canon fails as a hybrid system. They have so much name recognition, so much clout, so much nostalgia behind them that people would bend over backward, to buy this R5 if it lived up to the hype, if it did everything they said. And I think really, if they had just lived up to the promises, they would have undoubtedly the best camera out on the market. It would be a no-brainer for anyone, and the R6 for that matter. You have an R5 for if people who want to spend a little bit more money, get some of the higher end features, and an R6 that can do not as much, but almost all the same things for a cheaper price point for the people who maybe are more budget conscious. It would have been, hands down, game-changing revolution. People would have flocked to the EOS R system. As is, I think they'll keep a lot of the people that are there but I don't think it's going to win over many of the Sony people. I don't think it's going to win over many of the Panasonic people. And that's why I think they fail. Is it a technical limitation on their part? Do they just not have the technology or the capability or the intelligence? That's possible. I don't know. I can't read into behind the scenes of what's going on at Canon. But I know that for their aspirations for the R5, they've severely missed the mark in actual execution. And will they be able to fix it in a future camera? Maybe. But if time has told us anything over the past, if you go all the way back 12 years ago to the 5D Mark II, the progression has not been in Canon's favor as far as hybrids go. Again, photography, yes, they're fantastic. They're incredible cameras. There's Canon shooters, and there will be lifelong Canon shooters. However, the 5D Mark II was something special, and they have no obligation to maintain that, but it is disappointing time and time again when it doesn't live up to the initial expectation. And then especially when they say it's going to, they make promises about 8K RAW and 4K 120, and they can't deliver something that actually works in a way that's practical. Yes, the camera technically can do it, but with the overheating issues being so frequent, so common, such an issue on any kind of production, it's just not practical. So the feature might as well not even exist. Is this the nature of hybrids in general? Are they just doomed to be bad video cameras? No, I don't think so. There's plenty of hybrids out there, full frame included, that are wonderful video tools that Canon could have easily capitalized on that market and captured both the photographers, the videographers who are looking for something like this. And I honestly don't think it would cannibalize their cinema EOS line all that much, because those cameras are meant for a different type of shooter who want a different style camera body, who want other features, more pro features built into the body, such as XLR, ND filters, a lot more buttons, and flexibility in terms of using it on set. The R5 would have, could have, should have been a true perfect hybrid for everybody, and yet Canon continues to fail. Really wanted to talk about that because I don't know how, if I can describe it as best as I can, that of why it's not an excuse to just say it's a photography camera, don't use it for video. The 5D Mark II was like, that was the bar, that was the benchmark, and they've just been inching up ever so slightly from that point, and it's like, and you see everyone else is taking off. And we're going to get to Panasonic and Sony, but at least I thought I'd start with Canon because it's a good little history lesson, I suppose. I'm going to pop into the chat here. Awesome. We're going to move right along. Panasonic cannot seem to catch a break. For as much as I love Panasonic and the GH line of cameras, Panasonic just continues to lose, it seems like. They can't get it together for whatever reason. We're going to go through that. This will be a little bit of a history lesson, a little tour guide of the history of the GH cameras and what Panasonic has been doing with their hybrid cameras, the cameras that are meant for photo and video simultaneously. Why do they keep trying so hard and continuing to lose? And that's a relative term, but we'll get into it. If you go back to the beginning with the Lumix DMC GH1, this camera, hardly anybody had this camera. Now that's not fair. Some people did, but back in 2008, 2009, the 5D Mark II really stole the show. Everyone wanted the 5D Mark II or the 7D for that matter, and some of the follow-up Canon cameras. The GH1 was totally under the radar. This was basically a slightly better point-and-shoot type camera. Yes, it's interchangeable lenses with a mirrorless mount, but it's a 4/3 sensor. Like, who cares? It's not APS-C. It's not full frame. It's kind of in that quirky, weird, like, yeah, it's your tourist camera, let's say. It's the thing you buy as a consumer product. But what's interesting about the GH1 is that it did shoot video at the time. It just was terrible. It was awful video. Terrible bit rate. It was like a gimmick, basically, of, hey, you can do home movies, but if it was anything that was moving, the image would just turn to mud. It was garbage. And so the GH1 didn't get a lot of respect at the time until someone figured out how to hack it and up the video bit rate without leading to significant bugs or issues. This meant the main detriment of the camera could easily be fixed, and it had a flip screen, which is very advantageous for a video camera, for a hybrid to have. And the bit rates, you could get surprisingly high bit rates video from the GH1, which made the footage, the 1080p footage, look really, really good. It looked so good, in fact, I bought a GH1 instead of a 5D Mark II at the time. Everyone loved the 5D Mark II. Full frame video, incredible, but plagued by aliasing and moire. GH1, much, much less severe and higher quality, better resolution 1080p. You might think all 1080p is created equal. It's not. Just because a video is 1920 by 1080, there's other 1920 by 1080 that can look far more detailed, far sharper, a lot better. And that was the GH1 if you hacked it. And so these got called the GH13s, which is, it was still a really goofy MTS folder structure. It wasn't quite worked out workflow wise, but the potential, and did I mention the price? The GH1 was significantly cheaper than the 5D Mark II at the time. It was a consumer product. It was just this little camera that, you know, could shoot pictures and take some video. And it was actually a really powerful filmmaking tool at the time if you wanted shallow depth of field, which you can get with a 4/3 sensor. Is it as shallow as the 5D Mark II? No, but full frame isn't super 35 either, and most films aren't shot wide open at 1.4 or 1.8. Most films you watch have a deeper depth of field and narrower field of view because they're typically super 35. And so when you look at something like, you know, micro 4/3 with the GH1, it all of a sudden didn't look that compromised in comparison, especially when you consider the resolution. And this is in 2009, so this was just kicking off the whole DSLR video revolution type thing. And the GH1 kind of flew under the radar, but it showed promise, it showed potential. Then Panasonic, in 2010, September, announced the GH2, and they paid attention to the fact that people were hacking the GH1, and with the GH2, they increased those video features, at the same time increasing some of the photo features. Now, it was still 1080p, and upon release, it was hacked, and the bit rates were increased even further, which made the video even all that more impressive. Now we had a camera that was meant and designed for more of a video workflow and more of a video shooter's delight, as well as being a decent photography camera. Again, you're dealing with the smaller sensor, so people will always have complaints and criticisms. But the GH2 was incredibly powerful for the bit rates that you could get out of the video mode. And so, and this is for 1080p, right? You know, the higher the resolution, you know, kind of the more need there is for higher bit rates to actually capture the full potential of that resolution. So people were packing a bunch of data into 1080p files through a bunch of testing that was going back and forth and different versions of hacks and updates, and really kind of fun. Same time, people were doing something similar with Magic Lantern, but that was kind of a separate beast. It was a different way to go about hacking the camera. Magic Lantern on the Canon cameras was always more buggy than you would want and less reliable on an actual shoot. Many people shot with the GH1 and GH2 hacked and encountered basically no problems. If you stressed out the bit rate, you could crash the camera, but there were plenty of stable patches for it. So you really have this flurry of people adopting the camera, buying into the system, getting the lenses because of the power of doing both photo and video in this kind of, both executed fairly well for the time. Again, this is 2010 moving into 2011. Well, of course, the GH3 comes out, or is announced 2 years later, September of 2012. And GH3 is the one misstep I would say Panasonic made along the way in terms of their dedication. They marketed it as a video hybrid camera, but aside from the people who had the GH2 who were hacking it, they kind of already had most of the features that the GH3 provided. There were a few other software, firmware type things that the GH3 provided, but a lot of people who had the GH2 had no need for the better video quality of the GH3 because they were already hacking the GH2 to be on par with it. So the GH3 kind of fell by the wayside and really didn't make that much of a splash because it showed they weren't improving fast enough. Panasonic wasn't doing enough because you had an entire group of people who were kind of doing it themselves. via hacks. But then Panasonic goes and announces February of 2014 the GH4, one of the first 4K hybrid mirrorless cameras that was, incredibly affordable. 4K had been on the radar for a long time, but all these cameras, these hybrids, they were only doing 1080p. Now you've got a 4/3 camera that's offering 4K, 4 times the resolution in a camera that already does some of the best 1080p there is, right? The GH2 and the GH3, some of the best 1080p there is. Now the potential of even the best 4K, and I'm talking about in the hybrids, right? We're not talking about Alexas and Reds. This is purely just hybrids. So the GH4 comes along, and a lot of people bought this camera, rightfully so. It was always criticized as still not being full frame, and that's kind of why, part of the reason I think Panasonic, throughout all of this, kept losing. They kept trying the hardest they could, introducing 4K before everybody else, having these amazing video features in their hybrids, the flip screen, all the functionality, and it's not full frame. And that's been kind of the setback for the entire line, because frankly, a lot of people don't care about resolution or care about video features when your sensor is smaller. And that's probably not that fair of an assessment, considering how powerful the GH4 was and is to this day. But it was a step in the right direction. Panasonic fully embracing this kind of video hybrid functionality of their cameras and saying, we offer great photography and great video. We're going to give you video features you need. And the only setback is the sensor size. Of course, if you know, then announced January of 2017 is the GH5. 4K, 60 frames a second. Now you can do slow-mo 4K, which the GH4 was just, standard 24 or 30. Now at the GH5, you can do 4K 60. Oh, and you can do 1080 120, 1080 180 if you want to take a slight degraded quality 1080p. But you can go up to 180 frames a second in 1080 with the GH5, as well as internal IBIS image stabilization. This was a no-brainer for people who came from the GH4. The GH5 was an obvious and worthy update for the capability of shooting slow-mo 4K and stabilization, some of the best in the industry for a hybrid style camera. Again, though, still the 4/3 sensor. This was inevitably going to be Panasonic's biggest thorn in their side, is the fact that they were making incredible cameras, but the sensor size was just too small for some people. It is a criticism that is probably unwarranted, but it's a criticism nonetheless. So finally, in 2019, they announced the Lumix DC S1H. Well, actually the S1 came before it, but this is specifically the one that was most focused on video. This is the video hybrid full frame mirrorless camera that Panasonic put out, but came out late 2019, basically 2020. We've gone 12 years since 2008 when you had the 5D Mark II full frame video. Granted, it was 1080p and kind of awful at the time. It was really good at the time, don't get me wrong, but in hindsight, the 1080p on the 5D Mark II is nothing all that special. So it's taken Panasonic 12 years to finally implement a full frame video hybrid. That's why they keep losing, because they're just late to the game. They've been doing the right things, the right features. They do get pinged a little bit for autofocus, and that's fair. Their autofocus is not as great as some of the others, but in general, I think they would be far stronger in the marketplace if they had implemented full frame earlier. I wish they'd seen the writing on the wall in some ways, because the S1H, had it come out a couple years ago, instead of being their kind of new entry into full frame video hybrid style shooting, if we were already kind of looking towards the second or third generation of what the S1 series could be, the potential there of fixing things like the autofocus and improving upon it, Panasonic has the best video features in hybrids, hands down, compared to Sony and Canon and Nikon and Olympus for that matter. So should they be losing? I think it's kind of the nature of the beast of investing in 4/3 or micro 4/3 and it just not taking off in the way that people want. People want full frame and beyond. Now you have things like medium format implementing video. This is where things are going. It's what people want. Fewer and fewer people find themselves wanting smaller and smaller sensors for the sake of portability or weight. If you have a camera, a photography camera, it doesn't really matter how big or how heavy it is, because anything and everything is going to be heavier than the phone that's in your pocket. And smartphones, for that matter, have really affected the photography market, just because smartphones do the majority of photography for most people. They don't need an interchangeable lens system regardless of the sensor size. They're fine shooting on their phone. And so when you're looking at buying a camera that can do high quality photo and video, and you look at, do I want 4/3, do I want APS-C, or do I want full frame? Any one of those is much bigger and heavier than your phone, so you're probably going to go with the best one, which most people consider to be full frame. Now, does the S1H have special features? Yes. Is it worthy of recognition? Absolutely. But it's just kind of late to the game, considering Canon has been doing full frame video since the 5D Mark II. Again, not apples to apples. There is a very big difference between a 5D Mark II and the S1H in terms of quality. But in terms of underlying philosophy and principles, a lot of people might look at it at that baseline of just face value, full frame video. Panasonic's finally there, and I'm excited for the future and what it holds, especially with the L mount, as that's embraced by Sigma and Leica. But they have a lot of ground to catch up. People get invested in lenses and in systems, to where if they're buying Sony cameras and Sony comes out with a new camera, they're likely going to stay with that system. Same thing is true of Canon. Same thing is true of Panasonic. If you get people to buy the camera and buy the lenses and buy into the system, they will likely stick with the system moving forward. It's much harder to get people to shift systems. And you have years and years and years to where people haven't been shooting with the Panasonic cameras just because they haven't been full frame. Some of they are the best video features. That's why I've personally shot with the GH cameras. I mean, not my whole career, but a majority of my career over, since the GH1, because they're so video forward and video centric. And the S1H, same thing. But now the other brands are catching up as well. And so Panasonic has a long road ahead of them. They'll probably have to undercut if they want to stay competitive. They'll have to undercut pricing. They'll have to outperform the others. And competition is good, because it leads to things like the S1H and the GH5. And I should have maybe mentioned the GH5S. But some of those offshoots, I don't like to get into the weeds with some of those, because it just makes it a lot more confusing. So I think there's a lot of potential there. I think there's a lot of people who don't value the Panasonic cameras as they should, because they are incredible tools. But they just have the reputation of being the smaller sensor. And I don't think they can fix that anytime soon. Panasonic is going to have to try really, really hard. And the S1H is a step in the right direction. I hope they continue to keep heading in that direction and keep more steps coming sooner rather than later. The S1H is incredible. I just wish it came a little sooner. It'd be a great camera, a perfect camera 2 or 3 years ago. The fact that it came out at the end of last year, and now you have Canon and Sony doing very similar stuff, in many ways beating them in the frame rate game, it's tough. It's tough. I'm going to pop over to the chat, see what's going on. Trevor says, I think the S1H is the right camera at the right time. It has some of the best color science you can get, a hugely flexible mount, Tier A IBIS, and unlimited recording. All true, except Sony is right on their heels with the A7S III, and those two go neck and neck. And I think a lot of people are going to look at it and go, ooh, 4K 120. And that might put them over the edge. And the A7S III is cheaper right now. So if budget is a concern, that is another factor. Canon with overheating and Sony with only the ability to shoot 4K have more and more people looking at the S1H. I would say if the S1H had phase detect, they'd be stealing customers right now. That is the thing. The autofocus is their Achilles heel right now. If they can figure that out with some additional features that actually put them ahead of the competition, you'll steal people away. Too bad Canon got hacked and 10 terabytes of data stolen. I have not heard about this. Maybe I have to pull it up. The Canon hack. Is this something recent, like that happened today, or? Let's take a look. Did this happen? Oh my goodness, it did happen today. Breaking news. Canon had 10 terabytes of data stolen from its servers in ransomware attack. Canon can't catch a break. Wow. The following domains are being affected. Ouch. That's really unfortunate. Yeah, poor Canon. We're going to talk about Sony next. Pull up that if it didn't share it. This article on TP Review today, published today. Wow, that is rough. I think you take the S1H Price at $3,500 and leave it alone, and you put an 8K sensor in the body shortly after NAB. The camera can handle it. Yeah. I mean, the S1H has to come down in price. Has to, I think. It's just, it makes sense at this point with what Canon and Sony are offering. Even though it's not totally apples to apples, the S1H does have valuable features all on its own. But the price point, it is the highest priced right now of kind of those three main ones. And yeah, you put 8K in it, of course, yeah. Increase the resolution, but more importantly, focus on the autofocus. That is what's most important. And yeah, S1H just needs good autofocus. The people choose Sony over Panasonic just because of the autofocus. I am in that predicament right now myself. I'm looking at the S1H, I'm looking at the A7S III. I'm going, which direction do I go? This is a tough one. I frankly don't really like this might be weird, but I don't know, maybe y'all get it. The Sony lenses, I don't like how they look. The G Master ones, like they kind of look ugly to me. I don't know, the lens design of them, where I think the Panasonic ones and the Canon ones, the RF lenses, I think look the best. They have the best design for lenses aesthetically. Now, granted, at the end of the day, it should be about the optics. This is, like I said, this is kind of weird and not all that important, but it is just a personal thing when I'm looking at, oh, okay, what would a A7S III kit look like? Okay, which lenses would I get? And I'm kind of like, man, all these are kind of... And then also in Canon's favor, their 24-70 2.8 as image stabilization, where the Sony 24-70 2.8 and the Panasonic 24-70 2.8 do not have lens stabilization. You'd have to rely exclusively on the in-body image stabilization, which is fine, but it's again in Canon's favor for lenses that are relatively the same price. The 24-70 2.8 on from all the brands runs roughly $2,000. So you look at the Canon RF one and you go, oh, image stabilization, and then you think, oh, the R5 and the R6. Well, no, thank you. But it makes me wish the Panasonic and Sony had some better stabilization on those lenses. Just as like and again, I'm talking about like a basic kit, probably, you know, with primes and stuff, would go that route in some cases. But for the 24-70, which I would say in general is a pretty good lens to recommend for just general shooting, just to have as kind of your kit lens, that's at least what I kind of prefer, to have that functionality. You know, 24-70 is known for that. Like, that's what it's for, to be kind of, if you only can pick one lens, pick like a 24-70. Unless you really love a certain type of prime. But even like the 70-200 zoom, or like the wider zooms, they're more of the like specialty lenses. They're like in certain situations, they're not so universal. And then a prime, that's going to give you the shallowest depth of field, but then you're stuck with that focal length, and a lot of times it's not practical. Let's see. Yeah, not something they need. R6 falls in a tough spot. The R6 does fall in a tough spot. It has overheating issues as well. I know there's some modes where it doesn't overheat, but I believe those modes, I'd have to look up the chart again. But I don't want a camera that I have to think about, like, oh, I can't put it in that mode, the mode I want to shoot in, or if I do, then I'm rushed. Because apparently the R5 and the R6 overheat even when you're not shooting, right? Just being on, they're warming themselves up to the point where you're always chipping away and eating away at that time just by having the camera on and using it. Granted, there are modes that supposedly just work unlimited, but in that situation, it seems like such an inconvenience and a headache to where, you know, an A7S III, you're like, oh, it does all of that and I don't have to worry about overheating or any of that. Yes, please sign me up, because it works as advertised. And people will say 12 megapixels isn't enough for photography, which it depends on what type of photography you're doing. I think 12 megapixels is plenty for most people when they actually evaluate what type of photos they're taking and where they're being used. For massive billboard prints, well, even a billboard, people view it from so far away. If you want to do some massive high resolution print, then yeah, sure, get as much resolution as possible. In that case, you know, maybe you're even looking at like 100 megapixels from something that's like medium format, like the GFX 100 or something like that. But for people posting on Instagram or and just sharing their photography like casually with family and friends, and they're going to go get those photos printed at Costco anyway, 12 megapixels is probably fine, and most people they won't even know the difference. Granted, you're limited a little bit in terms of like cropping and, you know, after the fact, if you want to do any kind of manipulation in Photoshop or Lightroom where you're punching into a certain image because you didn't quite have the focal length. Yes, that's a limitation for sure with the 12 megapixels, but I typically don't shoot that way myself, so it's not something I really consider all that much for being like a need that I have to have 45 megapixels for the sake of like flexibility with my photos. Like it just doesn't come up all that often. Anybody ever buy a Lumix specifically because it has depth from defocus technology? Answer, no. Yeah, they like to the DFD, depth from defocus, which I suppose sort of makes sense the way it's supposedly the technology works, but just as a consumer, it sounds silly. With the fact that Sony took 5 years to come out of the A7S III, they've shown their hand. They're committed to clean, high-performing 4K, and it still overheats. It overheats if you're outside and you've put the camera in the sun, which the GH5 also overheats. So I tested that in a video, seeing if I could get the GH5 to overheat. And spoilers, it does overheat in the Phoenix sun in the middle of summer. The camera probably got over 150, probably up to 160 degrees would be my guess. The A7S III is going to overheat sooner than that. But I imagine with some shade or, you know, some cooling, which you probably don't want to be at. If the camera's overheating in those scenarios, you probably don't want to be out there as well. Granted, I'm not going to write it off completely and say like, oh, it's a non-issue, because it may be for you, but it's not as severe as what's happening with the Canon cameras where they're heating themselves up. So you can be indoor in a cold environment and the camera is still going to overheat because it's generating its own heat. The A7S III is susceptible to environmental heat, and specifically solar heat probably is the main culprit, but it's not going to just overheat itself. From everything I've seen, I haven't seen anybody encounter that. If that does exist, share a link with me, please, because I would love to see it, but I haven't seen anyone test the A7S III saying it warmed itself up in the same way that people can obviously demonstrate with the R5 and the R6. We buy the GH5 because it has other things and we tolerate the autofocus. Yes, indeed. The GH5 I bought for the video feature. So at the very beginning, while I talked about like hybrids suit the way I shoot so perfectly, because and specifically the Panasonic hybrids, because my emphasis and my focus is usually on video, but I love taking photos as well, and I want a camera that can do high-end photography if I need to in the moment. So having that all-in-one, something that can fit in a backpack, you can basically take it anywhere and have some of the best quality footage from a hybrid and decent, good photos. Yes, the autofocus might suffer, but I can basically shoot anything, you know, video-wise. I'm fairly confident I'm capturing it in a good enough quality almost all the time. There are some higher end projects, you know, commercial type work where you might rent something, or now with the Ursa Mini Pro, having that tool in the kit is great because like it's just that extra layer of professional features, professional quality, things like RAW, ProRes. But for a lot of stuff, the GH4, GH5, it's that perfect sweet spot where it's like it's as good as it needs to be, with the resolution being there, but not being the overkill of like some of the high-end Red cameras, or now the Ursa Mini 12K And like that's definitely reserved for a higher class of production, and it would be kind of silly to film like home videos or YouTube vloggy type stuff with like this enormous crazy 12K video. It's like that's so overkill for those situations. It's like, oh, I'll save that for the commercial project or the film I'm shooting, but for the day-to-day, like I'm traveling or I'm vlogging or I'm making a video tutorial about something, like you don't need to throw that much resolution at it. It's not practical storage wise for a hard drive, but also it's just like I don't think the consumer, the viewer, even cares either. They're not watching that kind of video and going, wow, thank goodness it's in 12K. Like, it does give you some options in terms of punching in and whatnot, but again, not a huge deal for me. All right, the chat is getting away from me. I kind of think I lost my spot. I'm gonna pop over and I'm gonna start talking about which is the last topic, which is Sony. So we've talked about Canon, we've talked about Panasonic, and now it is time to address Sony and why Sony keeps winning. Sony wins for some obvious reasons, but I thought it'd be fun to go through the history of the Sony cameras, their hybrid cameras, specifically the ones designed with video in mind, because that's how I like to shoot. I like to have photography and video all in the palm of my hand, ready to go. Throw it in a backpack, it's ready at a moment's notice, just put a lens on, throw a battery in, SD card, you're good to go. Why does Sony keep winning in this area where other companies seem to flounder and fail time and time again? Well, let's start at the beginning. This isn't the true beginning of all Sony mirrorless, but it's at least the beginning for me where I started to pay attention to Sony and what they had to offer in terms of a hybrid that did excellent quality video, and that's the A7S. I didn't buy it at the time, but I rented it and I shot with it a few times and I loved it. The A7S being known for its incredible low light capabilities. This is what put this camera on the map and what made a lot of people go, wow, I can shoot in pitch black and I can actually see what's there, and it's not awful, just minimal lighting, and I can have really clean images. Granted, it was only 1080p, which this was announced April of 2014. 2 months earlier, Panasonic had just announced the GH4 being their 4K camera. So the A7S was always up against the GH4, and at the time, the battle was resolution versus sensor size and the low light capabilities that come with that on the A7S. But the A7S was 1080p, and that's what it did. It did good low light 1080p with a full frame mirrorless camera when Canon wasn't really doing that in 2014. So the A7S III had that ding against it in that it wasn't 4K, but in 2014 you're also talking about a time where there were a lot of people who didn't even believe in 4K. It sounds kind of silly, but this has been a thing even since Red introduced the concept when the Red 1 was coming out, of 4K being a need or a necessity, and people saying 1080p is fine, 1080p is fine, it's enough, like that. Arri Alexa cameras notoriously like, oh, you only need 1080p, that's all you need. The human eye can't even see 4K, which is not true. You can see 4K. It just depends on the distance you are away from the screen. But in any case, the A7S had those people who hated it for the fact that it wasn't doing what Panasonic was doing with 4K, but it captured this part of the market that was looking for high quality video in a full frame video in a mirrorless camera. And the fact that they specifically designed the sensor with larger photo sites because they had less resolution to kind of see in the dark was a really, I don't want to say game changer, but I'll use that word. It was fairly impressive, incredibly impressive at the time, how good the A7S was in low light compared to everything else. But not my personal choice, because I opted for the GH4 in favor of 4K and some of those more video-centric features. But the A7S, it just had too many things that were against it in terms of video, but I think overall it captured the imagination and the attention of a lot of people and got people excited about Sony and these cameras buying into the system for the A7S in 2014. Then you move on to the A7S Mark II, announced September 2015. Now, this camera offered the 4K. And so anyone who criticized the A7S for only being 1080, now you've got 4K. But the ding again was that it didn't do high frame rate 4K. It just did 4K, 24 and 30. But again, incredibly good in low light, same full frame sensor. Now people are familiar with the Sony system. They have the Sony glass. Obvious upgrade to go from 1080 to 4K. And I should say that I think, I'm going off on a tangent here, but I'm pretty sure the A7S did allow you to do 4K, but it had to be to an external monitor, external recorder, which also too were a lot less common in 2014, more expensive. Today, you can get a Ninja 5 and they're, I think, like 600 or 700 bucks, and they can do everything you would want. Back in 2014, not quite the same. The A7S Mark II, now you could do 4K in body, but not the greatest codec. It's still 8-bit 420. Color grading is a little bit difficult with these clips. There were some minor inconveniences with the A7S II, but those baseline fundamental foundational principles of like what the camera is. It's a full frame 4K mirrorless camera that can see in the dark. That alone on paper, I think, sells it, and people are willing to work with the small batteries and the goofy workarounds for some of the file structure and recording time limits. If you're a video person and you need to record continuous, then like it is kind of a non-starter to look at something of like, oh, I can only record 30-minute clips. But in general, baseline principles, the A7S Mark II, obvious choice for a lot of people, and you saw a lot of people embrace the system even more and fall even more in love with Sony. Hey, listening, upgrading to 4K, giving us these features, even though Sony has a high-end broadcast, camera line for video. They designed a hybrid, the A7S, for video as well, and I think people really appreciate that, and the fact that it's not unnecessarily limited in the same way that Canon kind of does with some of the crop modes and stuff that they've done on their full frame cameras. And now where are we? We're at the A7S Mark III. Finally, 2020 announced in July, the A7S Mark III. And what does it do? It fixes all of the problems that people have constantly criticized Sony about. The batteries being too small and they don't last long enough. The flip screen not being convenient. Now it's got the right flip screen. Now it does 4K and it goes all the way up to 120 frames per second. They've implemented 10-bit. They've offered up all the things that people have criticized. The IBIS, internal stabilization. You've got the same great low light, a sensor designed for 4K video specifically, exceptional autofocus tracking capabilities. It basically is everything you would want in the camera to be. Every criticized thrown at Sony for the other A7S cameras basically falls away. There may be some minor annoyances and inconveniences with the A7S III, but in general, it does pretty much everything you would want. There's plenty of people who have done reviews and have talked about it, but I want to take this into the conversation of in the context of Panasonic and Canon and Nikon, like why has Sony done such a great job capturing people's dollars? Like they're in the business of making money. How are they getting people to buy their cameras? They're giving people what they want, and they're doing it. If you look at the A7S series, we talked about 3 cameras: the A7S, the A7S II, and the A7S III. They're making intentional, meaningful updates to address the main complaints and main criticisms and spending their time. The A7S III being announced July 2020, and there being basically almost a 5-year gap between the A7S II and the A7S III. That's a long time, but it gave them time to design a well-crafted, intentional camera that isn't plagued with a bunch of problems or limitations. They've really done the best they can to basically address every issue as far as I can see it. That's why I think they keep winning, because they give people what they want. They listen to the customer, and they know that what Panasonic is doing in some ways is better than what they're offering, and that what Canon is doing is better than what they're offering. And so how can they change their camera to maintain what it is, the S series specifically being kind of the video version. Of course, there's the A7 that's kind of the does it all, sort of, more or less, and then the A7R with higher resolution for if you're really into photography and you need that feature. But the A7S being the lower res, lower megapixel, 4K only, which I don't think they had to go 6K. I don't think they had to go 8K. I think at this time and place, a lot of people are just excited to have the 4K 120 with the A7S III. And that's why I think, again, Sony is winning, is just they're delivering what people want and what they expect, listening to the feedback, taking the criticism, and making adjustments, making changes quickly, but also spending the time to do it intentionally. It isn't just throwing a feature in there to throw the feature in there and then the camera overheats or it doesn't work quite right or it's kind of buggy. It's no, they put the feature in there and it works as advertised. And I think you're going to have a lot of people buying the A7S III, and you're going to have a lot more people, not only the people who have the A7S, the A7S II, and now going to the A7S III, those people, it's an obvious upgrade. Yes, get the camera. A7S III, though, is enough to get a lot of new customers, people switching systems, I think. People who may have been shooting Canon and they've been holding on, waiting, for the R5 or the R6, and they're going, oh, I'm going to go Sony. People who've been Panasonic a long time, maybe going to go Sony. We'll see how that all plays out once these are finally out there and you kind of get a feel for what people are using in the field. But it's not rocket science of why Sony's winning. They're just doing the right thing. They're making good choices. They're making good products. And then they're rewarded for it because people want to buy it. Pop back over into the chat here. Got a lot of stuff going on. Where was I? Let's just see if I find one that's a good one to read. One of the best features with the Lumix range is the live crop. It gives you a smooth dolly with a prime lens. I honestly, maybe I need to use that more often, but I just don't. So maybe I'll play around with that and see if I can experiment, come up with some fun things to do with the GH5. And then I also have a S1H coming that's a rental. So I'm going to test that out because I haven't used it yet myself, and I feel like it's got to get my hands on it to know which route I want to go, if I want to go the S1H route or the A7S III route. It's at that time where it's like, okay, but I would like a full frame camera to kind of handle certain situations that the GH5 isn't quite the best for. It works, but it would be significantly improved if I had a full frame sensor in some of the scenarios I'm imagining. So having an S1H or an A7S III, it's that, which one? So the S1H available right now, so you can obviously buy it. I'm gonna rent it, test it out, see how it does, and then look to maybe the A7S III, which could be on the horizon for me. I've done work for networks and feature films, and high frame rates is the most overrated feature. It depends on the content. For me personally, I like a camera with a lot of options, so I have more tools in my toolkit without my toolkit needing to be bigger. So I would equate it to literal tools that you can get from Home Depot. If you have to bring to a job site a bunch of different toolboxes for all the different things, that's really inconvenient. It's more stuff to move around. It's heavy. It's a burden. If you can put all those tools into one toolbox and that does everything you need, the same way you can put all these tools into a camera, that's the sweet spot, because you can go into any job and you can know, okay, yes, I can do that. Yes, I can do that. Yes, I can do that. Oh, this just came up. Yes, I can do that. That's usually how I shoot. Oftentimes it is unpredictable situations. Not everything is perfectly planned where we know exactly how things are going to go. It can be a little bit of, hey, here's the game plan, here's what we have going on, but then things can change. Maybe it's the weather, maybe it's the location, maybe it's the availability of something, so we have to make adjustments on the fly. Having more tools in that camera unlocks so much potential that if you're always limited to, well, I can't do high frame rates, or I can't do 4K, or I can't do 8K, or I can't do these things, more options is always better, because you can choose to use them or not. And I I do think some of these things can be overused in the same way that sliders, when those first kind of came out and everyone was doing slider shots, or then it became the gimbals, you know, and everyone was doing gimbal shots, and like everything was gimbal, or everything was slider. Use the tool intentionally for what it's for, same as high frame rate. Use it intentionally, and then you can kind of make the most of it, and you at least have it, rather than being, oh, I wish I had that and I can't do it. So I look at 4K 120 as a very valuable feature to have access to when I need it, compared to only right now, only having that at 1080 on the GH5, which is a limitation. I still think the GH5 is the best all-in-one compact unlimited recording camera. You can get very long battery life, an outstanding robust codec, and a full suite of small lenses. That is absolutely true. The GH5 is incredible, and the great thing about all of this is that they're only going to come down in price, but the features don't change, so you can always use them. I personally would like the benefits of a full frame camera now that the mirrorless stuff is finally there. For the longest time, 4K and the higher frame rates, it was reserved for the smaller sensors, and that was the balance you had. It was, you know, full frame field of view or really nice video features, 4K high frame rate. Now that 4K high frame rate is available full frame, that's kind of the best of both worlds scenario that I see, where the GH5, you can put a speed booster on it. That's going to get you to APS-C Super 35, but you're not getting up there to that full frame level, which is why I think it's smart that Panasonic has introduced the S1H. They needed to. It's been a long time coming, so I'm glad it's actually out there. And I shouldn't neglect the S1 and the S1R, also valid full frame cameras that do video and photo. I focus specifically on the S1H, again, because of my emphasis on video. Yes, high frame rate is just a quick trick shot. In practice, yes, you know, from technicians, yes, but oftentimes that puts your stuff over the top for a viewer. Your regular person who watches, you know, Chef's Table, or they watch Breaking Bad, or they watch, you know, whatever it is on Netflix. High frame rate stuff has been so ingrained into cinema, even from the days of like 300, you know, the Zack Snyder film, and that kind of cool, wow, Hollywood filmmaking magic that you can speed things up and slow them down and do these kind of really dynamic, cool shots. If you do a little bit of that at an independent level, or, you know, basically like on YouTube, it's why those tricks are so powerful for a viewer. Yes, I don't want to say it's a gimmick, because it does have the intended effect on the viewer of making them feel a certain way, rather than something else that is truly more of a gimmick, like I don't know, like 3D or something, right? With like the TVs are in 3D, and you're like, okay, it's not adding anything to the experience. Stuff's just coming at me, and my eyes are getting, you know, cross-eyed because it's hard to focus on it. So it is a trick shot, but the same way that like a slider or a jib or a gimbal is a trick shot. These are all just tools in the toolkit that you can use and overuse or underuse depending on the project. The problem the GH5 has, its 10-bit video and high-end codecs are not unique in 2020. It's losing its main reason why we buy it. Yeah, the GH6 needs to have a better autofocus. Like the Panasonic cameras, it is their Achilles heel. It is their limitation, and they need to fix it, and they need to improve to stand out. But that's the nature of competition. People are going to catch up, and you got to stay ahead, and hopefully they are. And if they're not, then they don't deserve your money anyway. Same thing I would say to Canon. Canon's trying, and they're failing. Sony cameras still have a unique selling point. Yeah, the low light is pretty cool, if that's what you're talking about, or maybe you're talking about the 4K 120, or maybe you're just talking about the fact that it's a Sony, and they've been doing this kind of the same way and improving and learning their lessons better and better and better over the past 5 years. The GH5 is a rock for a ton of pro shooters. Absolutely, 100%. The A7S was my first video camera. I loved it, but I was more than happy to move on when they improved it. It was a real hassle to handle and to shoot, definitely. And that's what's so important. And these manufacturers, they know that once you buy into their system, as long as they keep improving that system at a reasonable clip, people will probably upgrade to the next one if it's meaningful. I think that is where the GH3 kind of was a misstep for Panasonic. It just wasn't enough from the GH2, so I think they lost out on some sales there. But yeah, once you're at GH1, GH2, GH3, you start having some lenses and you're familiar with the menus and the system and how the cameras work and features that you come to expect. I still, for the life of me, don't understand why Sony can't implement shutter angle. Panasonic has had it. I don't know which was the first camera in the GH line to have shutter angle, but if you're shooting video, shutter angle is the way to go. And the fact that Sony still doesn't have it, and it's not even a hardware thing. It's just like in the firmware, just let me set shutter angle instead of shutter speed. That's my one little gripe with the A7S III. Can I get over it? Of course. You know, you can set shutter speed based on shutter angle, so it's totally fine. But it is annoying that this amazing hybrid that does great photo, great video, doesn't have what I deem a pretty important feature. Well, maybe feature is not the right word, just a function. Just be able to set shutter angle. Just add it to the menu. Like, be able to do it. Don't understand. I went from the A7S to the A7S II, and then the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera original to the GH5, and finally the S1H and the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera 4K. That is an interesting progression. Do you still have all those cameras, or did you sell them along the way? I will say the S-Log2 at 8-bit was a pain in the britches. Oh yeah, no, the A7S is not known for, you know, it has log, but then like grading it is the issue, which the GH5 you'd pay for vlog, but you have the option of some codecs that offer some more flexibility and functionality there. Thankfully, with the A7S III, it seems like Sony's embracing a similar mindset as with the S1H of just, you know, giving people dynamic range with log, but in a way that they can reasonably grade it and make it look good, and it's not just completely falling apart when you're taking into color grading. I ran my A7S II with the video device, the Pix E5H 4-inch recorder. Yes, absolutely. The Pix E5H, I think I used that one on, is it like sound devices? Is it one of those? I think I ended up liking that better than the Atomos at the time. Atomos is done. I've heard a lot of good things about the Ninja 5, haven't used it myself. I have, for the most part, been staying away from the external recorders lately. I have a Atomos Shogun Inferno that hardly gets used. Usually it's like a monitor if someone else needs to see, but lately it's, you know, the cameras do such a good job recording internally that I don't need the giant screen, the extra thing to bring. I like having it if I want it, but I also like a camera that can do it all, like built as is, so you don't have to add all this stuff and rig it out and then pull it apart every time. It just makes shooting really efficient, which is why I like the Ursa Mini Pro, is because like that camera is basically all ready to go. You can add an external monitor if you want. The same thing with the GH5. You can do an external monitor if you want, but it's not like you need to for some core functionality. It's just like an added benefit in some situations. Smells like software limitation is being used by Canon in regards to the overheating. Is that what you mean? And then Vlad says to search No Life channel. Even Gerald Undone said the plot thickens. Ooh, interesting. Let's do it right now. No Life. Is this like your channel, Vlad? Let's see. What is No Life? Do I have to search No Life channel or just No Life? Is this, what am I looking here? No Life channel. Am I looking for the A7S? What am I looking for? So this is funny. A7S is also a musician or band also that comes up. All right, you're gonna have to tell me what you mean, because I don't know what No Life is. A rumor, a source tells me that Sony is making it hard for Panasonic to buy their autofocus sensors. They can't negotiate PDAF licensing with Sony. They default to non-PDAF licensed sensors. That is the trouble, that Panasonic uses the Sony sensors. I believe they used to make their own sensors, Panasonic did, if I'm remembering correctly. Maybe it was some other manufacturer, but yeah, when you're buying product from what is the competition, yeah, it's definitely a sticky situation to be in. Trevor says, yeah, by Sound Devices was the Pix E5H. Way better build than Atomos, but they abandoned the features for some reason. I think they decided to stick with audio recorders. Yeah, the build, the Pix E5 was built like a tank from the shoot I did. It was a rental, but just worked beautifully compared to the Atomos, which feels a little bit more high-techy, but like not in a good way. It feels, I don't say cheap, because it's not cheap, but it's like overly flashy, you know, where you don't need, you kind of want buttons and things to feel kind of like more bulletproof and just work well. I remember at the time there was some issue I had with the Atomos. I forget what it was at this point in time, but yeah, I got the Pix for a shoot and it worked great. The slick thing about the Pix was that it was a full-fledged audio recorder. Also, it could handle like 8 tracks or something. That's really cool. No Life Canon R5. Oh, are we looking at, is this the theory that if you set the clock back in the camera that it like goes back to the heating setting from before? Like the heat sensor is all based on like the time of the camera. Let's look. No Life Canon R5. Overheating saga. Over 4 hours external recording, Ninja 5. Interesting. Ultimate comparison. So this is 5 hours ago? Is this the 5 hours ago? Breaking news? Let's take a look. The description says...
Past about 40 minutes. I don't see...
The description says the Canon R5 does not seem to overheat externally if you don't have any cards in the camera. In this video, I show, with as much proof as I can, how I'm able to record up to 4 hours in 4K HQ, 30 frames a second, 10-bit C-Log with IBIS and DPAF all on with no issues like the blackout or screen off issue myself and Gerald were having. The setup here is as follows. Well, okay, but this is 4K HQ, 30 frames a second. I guess. That's not necessarily the feature I'm after on the R5.
Like overheat warning. I don't have the card in the camera. The screen shuts off. I also have a dummy battery in. We're still going. We're nearing an hour. And we still haven't even gotten the warning yet. Usually when the warning comes on, you got a good amount of time left.
Wow, that's really interesting. Check out that video. This is cool. No Life needs some more subscribers here. This is a valuable information. And interesting. I wonder if Canon is doing some shenanigans behind the scenes, or maybe not having the cards in it is like a bug that is like it's supposed to still overheat. Like I don't know what the overheating protects from, like if you literally will melt your sensor or if that's just what people say and it's not actually going to do any damage. It would be interesting to see if the overheating is the kind of crippling of the camera, like intentionally built into the software, or if the fact that like, oh, if you don't put SD cards in it, then there's this exploit where you can work around the overheating system. Meanwhile, your camera is overheating internally and will cause damage. It's definitely interesting. Thank you for the recommendation. That's really good information. Canon R5 overheating saga part 1. Yep, without cards in the slots. This test makes no sense. It makes the R5 at least usable from the wedding interview standpoint. So if the camera doesn't do anything, if you're lucky, it will stay on. I don't get it. It shows the probably part of the limitation is intentional. Well, so this is tough because a lot of the tests, right, is like again, based on the marketing of what the R5 is like applauded for, 8K RAW, 4K 120, high-end features, high frame rate, high resolution. You're talking about 4K HQ 30 frames a second, and I know that mode also does overheat when you're recording to SD cards, when you're actually recording, But when this is passively outputting 4K 30 to a monitor, like you can apparently do 4K 30, not HQ, but you can do 4K 30 in the R5, according to one of the tests. I think it was Gerald's spreadsheet he kind of built out for where stuff overheats, and you can do 4K 30 internally, and it's not the HQ mode, but you can do it. But that's not like you can do 4K 30 on the A7S II. Like that's not the feature that. Granted, again, we're talking about codecs. They're a little bit different. I get that it's S-Log and 8-bit 420 and all that stuff, but again, underlying principles of like what sells cameras and like what people gravitate towards feature-wise and what they talk about. Because when you get into the minutia of like, oh, this codec and this and this, the Canon R5 and R6 overheat. This is a problem. Being able to get away with the camera not overheating in certain modes that are basically the modes that we've already all had on other cameras, and then there being new cameras that do some of the new modes, like the S1H does 6K, it doesn't overheat. The A7S III does 4K 120, doesn't overheat. Unless, again, you're outside in the sun, which is the whole thing. Like, there has to be a better way, like, talking about overheating, because there's a difference between the camera getting hot versus it just being hot where you're at. Basically, every camera has a limit. If you're in insane temperatures, every camera is going to reach the breaking point. However, it shouldn't be acceptable for the camera to reach its own breaking point on its own, even if you're in a 50-degree room. Like, that's unacceptable, that it's causing its own problem, if it is a problem. In which case, this test, it would be interesting to watch the whole video.
Keep going.
And play a little bit more.
Remember, it's focusing. It's at 10,000 ISO. It's working. It's working. So we've hit Gerald Undun's numbers of 75 minutes, and we still haven't gotten any overheating.
So
We have
don't put cards in your R5, I guess. That'll fix everything for you. Let's see. He's recording. He recorded for four hours. In his test, he's recording HQ for 4 hours. It puts the R5 close to the A7S III at least. It's still I mean, closer. Yeah, closer. But that's still far off from 4K 30 to 4K 120. I know it's still a bummer, but better than what we knew so far. Yeah, it's good information. Good information to know that it is an option for some people who may need it. He's recording outside the camera. He's recording externally. Yep. It's exactly the same fix the A7S II suggested, and in the end, it didn't fly with Sony users either. It's ridiculous. Yeah, it's... If you can find a way to record internally the features that Canon promised, that's the hallelujah. But until that point, it's goofy workarounds. This is, I went through the history of all these cameras and how we started with broken, busted hybrid cameras that kind of did video, but barely, the 5D Mark II video, moire and aliasing all over the place. If you knew what you were looking for, it looked awful. Granted, it had shallow depth of field, and so a lot of people liked that, but looked awful. The GH1, you had to hack it. It was, the folder structure is like so awful. The MTS files, disgusting. The A7S, the A7S II, like these workarounds, these goofy things. Now in like 2020, we're at a point where like the S1H is solid. A7S III looks solid for everything I've seen. You've got the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera. You've got things like the Zcam E2 F6 or the S6. Those Zcam versions. There's probably even a few other cameras out there. Fuji, people are talking about is it the X-T4? Someone mentioned this in the chat the other night, and I pulled it up, and I just didn't. I don't know what I'm supposed to be looking at as far as features, but it's APS-C, and it does 4K, but I don't know what the main selling point is here of like why the X-T4 is some mythical amazing camera, other than it's got kind of like the Fujifilm like kind of quirky design of it being more of like knobs and dials kind of thing, which is fun and cool. But let's see if I can see. B&H always does such a better job of displaying specs than Amazon does. Amazon's just like, here, read all these paragraphs, and you're like, what? XT4. Why is this price so much cheaper than it was on Amazon? All right, pop over to the specs on B&H. So it's APS-C. What am I looking for here? Okay, video. All right, 4K 60. Okay. Yeah. All right. Is there something I'm missing? Please illuminate me if there's something about the Fuji X-T4 that I'm unaware, but it looks cool if you're into the Fuji cameras, I guess. Let's see. GH5 is solid. Yes, Eugene, the GH5 is solid. The GH5, is it my favorite camera of all time? Does pretty much everything I need it to or want it to. It might be my favorite camera of all time. Flat says, Gerald and Dunn comment on the No Life videos. When I review cameras, I consider 3 hours of recording to be a complete pass. Sure, it might not serve every user, but 3 hours covers most people, I find. Yeah, but you're talking about external recorder. So you have to have the external recorder. You have to have it set up every time you want to do it. And if that's how you always shoot, that's fine. But me personally, I rarely have an external recorder or external monitor. I don't want to say rarely, but yeah, rarely. Like, there's a lot of stuff I shoot where I don't have an external monitor or recorder, either because it's inconvenient or it's just a burden, a hassle to get it to wherever we're going. So it just depends on the way you shoot and how you shoot. But I think needing the external recorder is a step backward, not a step forward. Vlad says it's very strange that it would change the overheating time so much by just removing the card. Very suspicious of the software. So is the case, Vlad, I'll ask you, is the case that if you just have a card in the camera and you're not recording, the R5 will still overheat in that mode, and that's why popping the card out is this kind of goofy workaround? Because I got to imagine, yeah, if there's no card in there, you're not recording to the card, so you're not recording, therefore is it going to overheat? Curious. At least it means there probably could be a fix if they wanted. Maybe. But I would not get your hopes up. Canon is notorious for crushing the hopes and dreams of filmmakers everywhere. I did a stream talking about the R5 rumors when they were just rumors and saying expectations versus reality. In fact, I don't have to watch it, but because I was gonna have to come out and say sorry. I was gonna have to say I messed up. I shouldn't have doubted Canon. I should have given them the benefit of the doubt. The rumors were true. It's all real, but no. I said in this stream right here, the R5 expectations versus reality, all the specs, and I said, there's gonna be something. There's gonna be something. It's Canon. There's going to be something that makes all of this kind of ruined. It wasn't crop. It's kind of the codec, kind of the recording limitations, but ultimately it ended up being overheating, which I don't know that it'd be interesting. Did anyone predict that? I didn't predict it. I just knew there was going to be something. Something was coming that was going to be that little gotcha, that little Canon magic they always like to sprinkle in there just to say, haha, you thought you wanted it, but now you don't. You're right, Canon. I don't want it anymore. I did want it because it sounded really cool. 8K RAW, 4K 120, autofocus, IBIS. Yeah, let's do it. Nope. Not this time. Not this time. And that's just that's their MO. Let's see. Yeah. Maybe I'll wrap it up there. I've talked about everything I want to talk about for the night. So I think you have these overwhelming trends. You know, I will say, to each of their credit, Canon, Panasonic, and Sony, because that's who we've talked about, Canon is designed for photographers first. I will not dispute that. That is true. However, a hybrid means a hybrid, and it should at least serve both audiences. It doesn't have to be equally. It doesn't have to be balanced where it's just as many photography features as video. I do think the Canons tend to kind of squeak ahead in terms of photography, and the video features are always a little bit limited. But in the case of the R5, it's another fail from Canon, because while they might try and embrace the hybrid mentality, time and time again, their execution lets the video people down. And I know the photographers out there will say, if you want a video camera, buy a video camera. But I don't want a video camera. I want a hybrid that does photo and video both well and both reliably. It doesn't have to be the best video or the best photo, but to consider it, I think it should be acceptable, or at least work as advertised. So that is why Canon continues to fail. Panasonic, on the other hand, they're just late to the game, but man, they're trying their hardest. In a lot of ways, I like to root for the underdog, and I think that's why I kind of like Panasonic, even going back to my DVX 100 days. You know, Panasonic is, I don't know, I've always had a sweet spot for Panasonic for whatever reason. They seem to kind of put the features in the cameras that resonate with me, that I find really, fun to use, which is why I say I really like the GH5. It's probably my favorite camera of all time, just because it is so fun to use. There are very few other cameras that are as fun and enjoyable. I would say the Blackmagic Ursa and the Pocket Cinema camera are very close, because their menu systems are incredible. Their features are outstanding. The Ursa Mini gets into, that's a cinema camera, not a hybrid. So you have some inconveniences that come with that in terms of size and weight, while the Pocket Cinema camera is there aside from battery life and then the flip screen. So a few features that make it a little inconvenient, but both great cameras. So a lot of good options out there. Yet Panasonic keeps losing to Canon and Sony, because it just took them too long to get to full frame, and now that they're there, they really have to catch up in the autofocus. And Sony just keeps winning because they just keep making good products that people want. I've said it before, I don't think it's rocket science. Maybe it is incredibly challenging and complicated what they're doing, but on paper, they're delivering the kind of specs that you would come to expect in 2020, and giving a few others above that. Redesigning the menu for one. Okay, good feature. Hey, these dual card slots are also multi-purpose, so you can use different types of cards in these two slots. That's kind of cool. That's kind of interesting. That's kind of fun. As well as all the additional responses to criticism that has been given to Sony, and they've embraced the criticism, and they've adapted and returned with the A7S III that addresses all of those things. So they keep winning because they keep improving and making good choices. And I think that's really what it comes down to. They were the first mirrorless full frame, I think. I can't think of anyone else who had a mirrorless camera that was full frame, that did, well, even photography, video, definitely. They just have been ahead of the curve, and they're staying ahead of the curve by making good decisions. So I'll end it there. Thank you everyone for hanging out, and I'll see you next time.